Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Do you want to attend a conference with top-level Angular speakers, but you can't afford the cost or the inconvenience of traveling? Well, Angular Remote Conf is an online conference September 24th through September 25th with live interactions, a dedicated forum, respected leaders in the Angular community, and best of all, you never have to leave the comfort of your own home to attend. The Web Platform Podcast listeners receive a 20% discount for Angular Remote Conf. All you have to do is use Web Platform, that's WEBPLATFORM, as the coupon code at checkout, and you get 20% off. And this works for group tickets, standard tickets, and early bird tickets. Head on over to angularremoteconf.com. That's ANGULARREMOTECONF. That's angularremoteconf, all one word.com, and sign up ASAP to get the maximum amount of savings.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 61, the Return of Bosonic. Bum, bum, bum. On our panel today, we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
And I'm Eric Isaacson. And we have a guest today from the Bosonic Project, and that is Rapha&euml. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in this project and, kind of web components and your feelings?
Yep. Hi, everybody. I'm an agile project manager for a little company that is called Via Report, and with my team we build web applications for financial services. So we build applications which are UI extensive. Basically, our customers love one tool. It's Excel. So we need to build applications with roughly the same features that Excel. So we build single-page applications for 5 years now. When we started at the time, I think only Backbone was released, I will say known as a JavaScript framework. But as Backbone didn't provide any UI components or tooling for building components, we started with YUI. It was obviously a bad choice. So we started the next project with Ember.js, which was very new at the time. And in our quest of the perfect framework, we tried Angular, of course. And now we had a phase with a sort of vanilla.js framework. And now we simply use React. So the main thing is that and I personally find myself frequently rewriting the same UI elements in the new framework of our choice. So it was tiresome and a little absurd. So when I stumbled upon the original introduction to web components specification or draft, I was seduced immediately. So we began to trial the two libraries which were available at the time. Of course, Xtag and Polymer. Polymer was too feature-rich for our tastes, and I must confess that some polyfills like the Shadow DOM one was way too complex for me. So we started a project using Xtag, and it was cool, but the fact that Xtag didn't use template elements makes that makes the how to say that the DOM creation or the element markup creation by hand a little tiresome. So I decided to start my own project. It was Bosonic, and initially I decided to focus on a tool that could transform code. I liked a lot the initial element declaration that you found in the introduction to the web component spec. So I made a tool that that transforms that code into a vanilla JS web component. The problem was that it took me a lot of time to build that tool, and so I had not a lot of elements to provide to users. And when I released Bosonic, I must confess I had been surprised by the lack of feedback from the community. It took me a long time to understand why Bosonic and web components in general didn't get adopted by web developers. And as a matter of fact, there was a lot of people who were voicing their concerns about web components, but only privately. After talking with a lot of developers during conferences, meetups, and so on, I began to understand that the main problem was that for people, the web components paradigm was not a good one to build their applications. So I began to understand that maybe we failed in our web components evangelization by the fact that we focused on it's a good way to build UI components. You can build your own components with Polymer or Bosonic, Xtag, and so on. But the fact when you say that to web developers that have very good tools like React, you can't seduce them. So I think now that what developers want are simply practical elements that they can simply drop into their project, into their project's templates, and go with that without building themselves their UI components. So
no, go ahead.
That's why I decided to reboot the project, and now I've decided to focus on building good elements. I want to at least for a first step have a set of elements that can do practically the same thing that Bootstraps one, and maybe a little more because of course in my work I need to have some elements that can be alimented with data. So of course data grids are something I have in my mind.
Well, I mean, going through the types of clients, going back to that you have for your needs, data grid sounds pretty common, right? So you have a lot of Excel type of functionality, so you're going to need data grids, you're going to need these type of cell structures, you're going to need lots of math and lots of methods to do certain things like drop downs within those cells or things like that. But so would you say that these elements in Bosonic are more geared towards like line of business, financial, desktop applications, or would you say that they're more universal than that?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure that data grids, for instance, are a good choice for web components because they deal with data, and obviously it could be a lot better to deal with for dealing with this data to work with a framework, a library like React. So for now, the data grid element is only an experiment. I want to see how far I can go without compromising performance. But even if it's not an element for production, it could still be a good element for prototype things. So that's for data grids. But to answer your question, I want to focus on the most low-level elements. I don't know how to call that, but Bootstrap is a good analogy. I think not every developer needs, for instance, material design elements. I think a lot of developers need more simple elements, more basic elements, and more customizable elements. Yeah.
More Bosonic in components, right?
Yeah. Right.
So seriously though, like I was listening to Corey House. He's a developer who he did a course on web components, and the last 6 months he's sort of been really immersed in React. And it was interesting. He was on .NET Rocks podcast talking about web components a little bit as a side on React, and he was saying like that a lot of the modularity in applications is moving towards this more like simpler component structure, but also on the back end we're using like microservices more often, and those type of modular smaller pieces that we're connecting together with something on the back end. So it's interesting. It made me think of like I agree you don't want to tie data to something like this. You want it to be maybe responsible for data, but not tie it directly. So I was wondering like how I would go about that, and I think some of the ways that like Google has handled it, they went through a whole bunch of different variants in the labs and on their private GitHubs and figuring out like Firebase is a great example. If you look at the history of that, it moved from org to org on there, but it was originally a labs project and now it's like mainstream. And the way they do APIs now is it's like they just do the API and then you have other elements that interact with that API, and it's like a non-visual type of thing. Is that something you could see like utilizing for a data grid, like nesting that type of element inside of the data grid? Do you think that would work?
I don't know. That's the main reason why I'm not sure data grids are a good thing to do with web components. In fact, I tried to make Bosonic elements workable with React. I know there are people from the React team that don't like web components in general, but I think web components and React can be complementary. If you only use elements that deal with basic JS or DOM behavior and that are not linked with data, you can use that with React without any problem. So that's why, for me, elements that deal with data are only experimental, and I will see if I can make a thing that that could be workable with React and other frameworks. That's the main problem. How to make a component that can deal with Angular or React, which have different ways to deal with data.
Right. I mean, I think if we look at regular standard HTML elements, you can kind of see that, you know, your data is usually inputs. You're sending information to that via attributes or properties. So it's not as complex as we're making a lot of these components.
Yeah, and the fun thing is when I started with Bosonic, and I started to think about components that deal with data, I search in all HTML specifications some samples of elements, of actual elements that deal with data, and the only one is the data list element, which can be used with an input element for auto-completion. That's the only case in all HTML of a tag that deal with some kind of data. So we don't have any inspiration to make custom elements with an API which is DOM-like, if you see what I mean. That was just a remark.
So it's like traditionally web components have, I think they kind of got a little misunderstood because the specs were changing so rapidly, and everyone was, you know, not everyone, but especially Google, we were all pushing for these things to be pushed forward, and they kept changing underneath our feet. And so I think it was frustrating for a lot of people, and so people sort of lost faith in this. And now it's sort of coming back. We've got a lot of lessons learned across the board from, you know, the other libraries, Bosonic, you know, and it's been really interesting to see how things have changed. So Bosonic originally had this build step, and you would compile things, and you've gotten rid of that altogether. You've lost IE9 compatibility, but it looks like that's on the roadmap for the future. And can you say kind of what was the feedback from the community and the misunderstandings with Bosonic and web components that you noticed throughout your travels?
Well, the main misunderstanding, as I said before, is developers think that that's a technology to build apps, and it's absolutely not the case for me. It's way too low level to make apps. Of course, you still need to use some kind of framework to make it simpler. And the other thing that it's about Bosonic more than web components. People didn't like the fact that Bosonic required a build step. It's quite surprising, but there are still developers who don't want to install Node.js or and npm. Yeah.
Say it ain't so.
Yeah, that's the case. So that's why with the reboot, I decided to simply use for now the web component JS polyfills. Of course, it costs me the IE9 support, but I think I can bring it back with my transpilation tools. So about the transpilation tools, you say the specifications change. That's a thing. They change, and that's why that's one of the reasons I wanted to make this transpiler initially. What I had in mind was the fact that with a transpiler, if the specifications change, I could simply transform again the elements code into something that will work with the new specification. And so I think I probably will bring the translation tools back in order to cover our asses about that kind of specification changes.
Yeah, I really like that idea of having it transpiled at build time so that you don't have to worry, and ultimately you get that boilerplate code. But I do really like the way that you've updated, looking through the GitHub, and I got the chance to go through the docs pretty in depth. You have this very simple runtime that you use. It's just like one file that's like less than 200 pages of easily readable JavaScript. And I think that's really helpful, and I think a lot of people are just writing their own if they make these web components, or using Polymer because Polymer gets battle tested, right? Really hardcore. So, I mean, it's really interesting to see like, I'd really love to know the users out there who have tried the transpiler, what they liked or didn't like about it, because it sounds like a very interesting approach.
Yeah, but you need to install a lot of things to make it work. You simply can't try Bosonic with a GS bin or something like that. You needed to build the elements, and for people it was not always easy to start with.
Yeah, and when you had it that way, did you have your elements like in compiled form so that somebody could use them in JSBin?
Yeah. Yeah, of course it was possible. I don't know. I don't know what to say. I think it's simpler. It's simpler now for people to get started with Bosonic, and that's the more important thing. I think.
Yeah, I think writing native code with the the specification, because of that big shift in how everything changed, a lot of people didn't want to bother. That was like the first look I had at web components, was I wanted to learn the native APIs, and now Shadow DOM is being implemented across all of the major browsers, which is exciting. There's no timeline for like Internet Explorer or Safari, obviously, or any of them, I should say. But they have this whole new way of working with Shadow DOM, so things are going to change rapidly even now. Yeah. It's going to be really interesting to see how ES6 plays in, and I'm really hoping more people make vanilla components or use Bosonic as sort of a helper library to do this, because it's interesting, kind of your approach now, how you've changed it, and these helper elements will fit for a lot of things. But if you wanted to make an element, it seems like that's not really what Bosonic is about now, but you could do that and just use those helper methods in that runtime.
Yeah, of course. In fact, Bosonic adds only a very thin layer on top of the web component JS polyfills. It's not that hard to build the web components using vanilla JS. It's just a little verbose, and that's why I still propose this thin library that I use myself, of course, to build the elements. But I begin to add some helpful methods into Bosonic to make elements building more simple. There are a lot of ideas in Xtag or Polymer that are really interesting and important. For instance, I'm actually adding something to help with support of mobile gestures. The first step is to provide a sort of unification layer for mobile and desktop events. And for that, I simply intend to include a little library which is called the end.js. It was built by another French who works at Microsoft, David Catu. And it's a tool that adds that polyfills pointer events into every browser. So as you may know, pointer events was initially a Microsoft thing. Google and Apple decided to go with touch events in the touch events way. But then Mozilla decided to use pointer events into Firefox. So I think providing pointer events support is a good thing for Bosonic. So the first step is to include this library into Bosonic to add pointer events, and then I will add custom events that will be triggered by Bosonic to support basic gestures like a simple tap or a tap, hold tap, or simply a move gesture, that kind of thing.
Yeah, as far as the polyfills go, you talked about IE9 support going down, and my understanding, if I look back at some of the old code that you had and some of the Xtag code, because I think Xtag supported IE9 at one point, there is the biggest issue, it seems, is shadow DOM. So yeah. if you were to use something like how Polymer, and I don't know exactly how it happens underneath the code, I haven't looked at shady DOM stuff, but if we had something like that, we might even be able to get support for IE9 without, having that, and it might be a lot simpler than we think. I think Android is going to be the harder cases to test. I think it's just testing it a lot. Like Andrea Giamacchi, or Gia, you know what I'm talking about? Web Reflection on Twitter.
Yeah,
he has that IE8 and up support for these things, which I'm looking at now. What are your thoughts on that?
I wanted to use this custom elements polyfill from Andrea Giamacchi, I think.
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah, it's him. Actually, I think polyfilling custom elements is a lot more simpler than shadow DOM. It's of course evident. Because I wanted to support IE9 initially with Bosonic, I tested the custom elements polyfill from Polymer with IE9, and it worked. It worked natively without any problem. So the problem was, like you said, shadow DOM. So I built my own polyfill, which was not a polyfill. It was more a fake shadow DOM. I simply used document fragments to add some kind of API that looked like shadow DOM, but it wasn't shadow DOM. And as it's roughly the same way, the same thing that shady DOM does, I think probably I should have a look to it, but I think it's probably possible to add IE9 support to shady DOM, and with this in mind, of course, HTML imports is not a thing you can possibly or simply polyfill with IE9. So, but with a simple build step that will concatenate all your elements, you only need custom elements polyfill and shadow DOM or shady DOM polyfill, and you're gone. You're done. Sorry. So I think with that, it's possibly. I think it's possible to bring back IE9 support rapidly.
Yeah, and some of the other things that people don't realize, sorry Justin, is that a lot of the things that we take for granted that we used jQuery for back in the day is like class list and like polyfills for the custom events and things like that. Like custom events are key to communication with the elements, in my opinion. So those things have to be put in for polyfill.
It's done. I mean, I have done that with the initial version of Bosonic. I added. It's really easy to do. All you have to do is to go to the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network documentation, and you found every polyfill for these basic features for IE8 and 9. So I added effectively the class list polyfill, the node list polyfill too, I think, and something for custom events. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose my question would always come back to is the IE9 support really that big a deal? Like, I mean, from a corporate standpoint, I do understand. I mean, we have people in the same boat who are in the land of IE9, but with IE9 on its continual death spiral at this point, and should our efforts for developing these libraries and frameworks for the web be more focused on not just the future of what we considered, your top flight sort of browsing experience where you have you have things like Chrome and Firefox and Edge, but obviously there are developing markets that are getting an entirely new web experience in Africa and everything else. I mean, should we be focused more on the future of things, or should we continue to look back and say, well, I should spend time building IE9 support?
It's a very good question. Back in the days when I started with Bosonic, we needed to support IE9 in my company because a lot of our customers still used Windows XP PCs, and we proposed a very old tool that was only compatible with IE8. So,
ouch.
It was a need for us at that time. Now we definitely dropped IE9 support. That's why I decided to reboot the project with only the IE10 support for now. And I want to have the feedback from the community. I want to know if people really want IE9 support. Because for one thing, it's costly to support IE9, and of course, if it's not necessary, if it's only did code. So, but the thing is, there are still, I think, a lot of big companies that still have old versions of IE in production in their information system. I think we tend to forget that there are a lot of people that are locked into old version of IE in their everyday work. I want to have the feedback of the community about that because I don't want to make a choice for now. But I will still have a look to see if it's simple to do. If it's simple, there is no question. I will bring it back.
Yeah, since we do a lot of at Deloitte Digital, we do a lot of work with government. So there is that whole IE9 is usually the lowest common denominator for our clients, but we do have the occasional IE8 still. And I will always push back and explain the security risks that you have with using XP and the flaws that you'll encounter. But if they're making money off of that, and it's the user base is higher than a certain amount, they're not gonna back down. So then you have to decide, well, is this technology really right for this particular project? And a lot of times web components won't be in that case. So for us, it's like that. And then we have to worry about mobile devices. Like I think the biggest thing, I mean, Aaron Frost talked about this, and then I wanted to test his theory where I went into drugstores and different different small stores that you wouldn't expect, like supermarkets and things, and looked at the smartphones that they sell, and a lot of them are just in the United States. They're on old Android, like 2, 3. It's scary because the APIs on there, that are available for the web are really, really poor, and there's a lot of edge case problems. So if we need to support those, which we've been lucky enough that we haven't too often, that's going to be a problem. And some clients are still having those issues depending on their customer base.
Yeah, but the problem with that scenario though is that so I mean I feel the pain. I feel the pain all the time because of IE7 and 6 because we still have people on those sorts of things. And that's painful, but they also don't understand. My problem with the open source world is that everyone says I need IE8 or I need IE9 support, and you're having really talented developers who are building great open source software spend time on what is basically dying tech, right? We know that it's dead, like it's just on life support inside corporations who want latest and greatest things. You know, how many times have we all heard, "Hey, why doesn't the app work on my iPad when it works on my desktop in IE7?" Well, that's because you didn't take the time to invest in the latest thing, and you've continued to pump money into the thing that could have been continuously updated. So, I mean, it's tough when you see, these little fractions who, well, I need to support corporate, and corporate has, they made money on this. Well, you also have to maintain your infrastructure. Like, if you're going to stay in the past, then you're not going to get the latest, greatest thing. At some point, you do have to make that leap. And if they don't want to make that leap, then they don't get the latest and greatest. And, my 2 cents, obviously, but it's painful to see talented guys working on ancient sort of things that should die.
And it's important if you can talk to clients and convince them early on. That's great. Like, and I try and do that all the time because it's better for them, it's better for us, it's better for everybody, the users especially. So yeah, I mean pushing them, but if it's just you have to figure out where's that cutoff point because you want to support backwards if you're building a framework, but you can't test everything. Even with the large community that Polymer has acquired, right? There's no way you're going to be able to test every edge case. So you have to figure out, well, what is worth the amount of time and overhead to develop, and then if somebody has that specific need and they want to commit back, that's great, but we can't spend the time to do that now for the majority.
Yeah, of
Agreed.
course. And personally, I prefer to focus and to spend my time on building good elements that work with the most devices possible than making it work with old IEs. But one thing I wanted to say about IE, I think the worst thing is the fact that many big companies have very old intranets or internal applications that required very, very old versions of IE. And so we have a lot of sysadmins who are forced to force the compatibility mode of IE. And so we have customers who have an IE10 but that behavior like an IE6 or 7. And so, that's the worst thing that can possibly happen to a developer, I think.
Yeah, I've had clients like that as well. It's really hard because it's so ingrained in their systems that the arguments are really political and they're really like monetarily driven where, well, we made the commitment to this. So it's hard discussions to have. The more I'm doing more leadership and management, the more I'm realizing how difficult those conversations are, but they're necessary to have.
At a time I even used I don't recall the project name. It was a thing that you could embed a web application into a WebKit, and it acted like an executable one thing. You know what I mean?
Chrome Frame.
Yeah, maybe.
Chrome Frame used to do that. I mean, that was amazing, primarily because of the craziness that went into it to get it to work around some of the permission models within Windows.
Yeah.
And I remember using it. I mean, it was top notch in terms of being able to do the sort of things that you needed to do just to get work done. And I think that's problematic, right? Is that so many times new developers who don't want to install build systems because they haven't ever had to use one before, or they don't understand sort of where the web came from, and they only see this thing that I can still download pieces and then plug it in and it all should work, and they don't understand or comprehend quite yet the entire support chain that you have to maintain to keep working applications in most environments. And internal wise, that can look very ugly. Externally, in a perfect world, we're all in wonderful greenfield land, but we're not, right? We inherit things, and we do the best we can as developers to sort of mitigate as many problems as we can, no matter what that tooling is. And ideally we would have support for everything, but you can't. And you do have to continue learning these things, otherwise things don't work.
Yeah, for those that aren't aware of what Chrome Frame is, Chrome Frame was a plugin that you could get for Internet Explorer that would actually use, if you had Chrome installed, it would use Chrome's runtime and features inside of Internet Explorer. And this was great because now you can use more modern APIs and not have to worry. This was bad because it's a plugin. And so you're forcing your users to actually use this external code. And so they eventually discontinued the project, but it was pretty awesome and pretty horrible at the same time, in my opinion.
Yeah, of course.
So we've diverged into some awesome conversation away from Bosonic, but related. One of the things I noticed in Bosonic is the custom element spec has taken out the declarative element, but we still have it in Bosonic. And was that more so that people felt comfortable using more declarative ways of doing this? Or is this something like you're seeing it as, well, it'll be back in the spec, so I'm going to just think forward and put this in?
I didn't understand your question exactly.
So the element tag in HTML, right? Because of performance reasons, was taken out of that spec because implementation. Once it was implemented, the browser vendors realized, wow, this could be a little rough, so we have to go back and rethink this.
Yeah, I love that element tag. It was really aesthetic, I would say. So that's why I decided to use it back in the old days of Bosonic, and I still want to use it because it has been dropped, I know, but it will probably reappear, I think, sometime in the future, and it's not very different than using a custom element like Polymer does with the Polymer element tag. That's the reason I prefer to use for now, because this element tag is not implemented in browsers. The browser see it as an unknown element, so you can use it. It's not really a problem.
And one thing I noticed on the GitHub was in your releases, you have one release, and it's 1.0.
Yeah.
So the old code that you had, was that all stripped out? Did you have multiple releases in there? Like, how did that? I would have assumed that since this was a reboot, it would have been a 2.0, but it's not. Can you explain that?
I had published npm packages with the version which was inferior to 9.0. The fact I wanted to release the 1.0 because I wanted to mark the fact that it's a reboot. It's not the same code, the same project anymore. I don't know if it answers your question, but
it's just a curiosity. It's not like a judgment or anything. I was just curious, like how it's working.
I know. But I wanted to have, I have a friend who we think that semantic versioning, you should always release your first version as 1.0. I don't have the specific reasons in mind, but I trust my friends, so I did that.
Fair enough. And the elements that you have, are they the same ones as you had before? You have them in 3 sets: D&D, core, and data. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, they are exactly the same ones, but rewritten, of course, and a bit enhanced too. I decided to merge them into 3 repos because it was tiresome to deal with a repo with for each element. That's the only reason. It's a practical one. It's the same elements. I didn't add. I think I coded the tooltip myself. The old tooltip used an external library which was Tether. Sorry. Because now I don't want to build elements that depend on an external library, even if it's a good one. I prefer to do things myself and to have the more DOM and vanilla JS code you can have, so that Bosonic elements can be used for education purposes too.
So, I mean, as far as these are built, it's definitely a different structure. It's much more flat and simple than some of the web components I've seen, which is great in my opinion. But I don't see any demos on there. Are you doing like documentation? Are you following any gold standard, like on the web components org and on GitHub?
Yeah, of course. I try obviously to follow these gold standards. The thing I try to put the most focus, the most possibly. I don't know. Accessibility is very important for me. I had a lot of talks with accessibility experts, and I'm now convinced that I must put the most focus on that. So it's for me it's the main the principal gold standard I try to follow. The
Excellent.
other one are for me the most important thing aside of accessibility thing is to have elements that have an API which is the most closer possible to standard HTML tags APIs.
Excellent. And do you feel like you'll have new element sets or sets that are not UI based, but more like Iron Ajax type of stuff, where it's not visually seen, but it's more of like doing some kind of functionality or things like that?
I have a very long to-do list of elements. I have currently maybe 20 or 30 elements I want to build. Not Ajaxy things. I'm not sure Ajax things are good ones to build with web components, but a lot of basic UI elements that you can find in Bootstrap and more. I try to look at all the UI element I see, even not web components one, and when I see something that I attract my attention, I put it in my to-do list.
Yeah, I know that Brick hasn't been worked on too much, the Mozilla project, lately, but they had all native components as well, and they had a bunch of nice ones there. Like Carousel, there was a flipper, like a flipping type of thing. So it's interesting. I'd love to see like a lot of these like vanilla JS components sort of find a nice home together, like on Component Kitchen or in Custom Elements IO is some filter that you can just find vanilla components or find only Polymer components, and that might be there. I haven't seen it.
Yeah. One thing, there will never be a carousel element in Bosonic. I'm against that. Maybe for the 1st April, I will bring a blink element, but only for one day.
2008
Blink.
e-commerce thing.
I will support Blink, but not carousel. I agree with that entirely.
Well, also, Jan Miksowski, I think his name. If I butchered your name, Jan, you can smack me, please. But he did the gold standard, right? And the gold standard repository on web components. And he also did this project recently. He started called Basic Web Components. And I know you've had a chance to look at that. And his research on there, if you look at the documentation, is really awesome as well.
Yeah.
But he's using all Polymer, so I'm a little confused. But it's Polymer's awesome, so we'll see.
I contacted him yesterday because I think we probably have the same goals in mind. So I want to talk with him to see if we can do something together. Because
awesome.
Because for me, Bosonic, I don't want to how to say that. For me, Bosonic should be a community project. What I want to do is to, I don't want web components to become a sort of jQuery plugins where you go to a website that lists all plugins available, and then you are forced to find your way into this mess because there are a lot of plugins that do the same thing, but you don't know if it is maintained, if it works well. It's like Drupal module. It's exactly the same problem. That's why I would like Bosonic to become a sort of curated library of basic and practical elements, web components. I want to involve the community. I would like to see some of these people that start project of web components. I want to work with them because there is Polymer, which is Google backed. There is Xtag, which is Mozilla backed, but I think the original
Microsoft back now.
Yeah, now exactly. I think it would probably be better if we had other project driven by the community.
Yeah, I think you've brought up a really good point. One of the problems I've had with these components is in like jQuery, for instance, you go to the registry, there's like 3, 4, 10 sometimes of these elements, and none of them have any information. There's no description, there's like a title, and like no API, no what are the methods on this, what are the properties, there's nothing. And then you go to the page, and some of them are well documented, I will give it that. Most of the well-documented ones I found are the paid ones where you have to go to their site and download them. But those are for jQuery specifically, even. And like you said, with PHP, like in CMS type elements, it's the same thing. This is a problem that we've had in components throughout the web and before the web, I'm sure. And one of the things I was thinking of, I talked with Jan about this and Rob Dotson, and what I'm looking into is taking like that gold standard and trying to figure out how much of this can we automate in some tool in a build that you could take as an npm module or something like that, and assess your own project, and it'll do like it'll write out a certificate of score or something. So you would have like some badge or something that would say, I rate this much in this area, I have this much in this area, these are the things that I rate as but via some configuration or something. This is just like off the top of my head. But to have some sort of community-driven ranking, and you could see like how often these things are updated and who maintains them, that's really important because that's something, if you go to a plugin and there's 3 available and none of them have been updated in a year, how do you make a decision on that? Do you write your own? It's not an easy decision.
Yeah, of course. You bring a very good point. I'm not sure if it will be possible to automate something like that, but it will be
some of it you can.
Totally awesome. You could probably do that for some aspects of elements like accessibility ones. But I think we need simply human curation to do that. What I want to do with Bosonic, I'm very open I'm very open. I want developers to contribute to Bosonic, and so if someone proposes me a new element, if it is well written and it follows the gold standards, and if the other accepts to maintain effectively its element, it will go in Bosonic without any problem. But if the maintainer quits and I can find another maintainer, I will probably get the element out. I think that the only possible system that can work in order to have a very well done library of web components.
Yeah, I really like the idea of having the curated type of system.
I don't want to do that myself only. That's why I want to have to build a community, to have a sort of committee who can curate elements.
Well, that's the thing is like I was talking about with that tool. There's a good portion of it you could automate, but not everything. And so you really can't. There's some things you have to manually go through and figure out.
Yeah.
And so like you can't just have the author of it say, yes, I am 100% on all of this stuff, because most people are honest, but it's not really a system of checks and balances that way. So we'd have to figure out, like, if we're going to have this as a standard, like some sort of way of identifying what the best components out there are for what you're doing, then it would be great. Like, you'd need a community backing. You couldn't have one person just curating this.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Justin, what do you think?
I think it's hard. I think that's. I think that in theory, like, I like the idea. Like, ooh, look, this would be the one that best fits you. But the problem with development is that is a very sort of personal choice in a lot of matters, right? I mean, people have preferences, and preferences are hard to sort of put in order of things for all people. Curation is hard. I mean, to some extent, I attribute it to music. Like, try to curate music tastes for like random groups of people. Like, it doesn't work, right? You can't.
Yeah.
Like, you can try, and it's gonna kind of work, and then you're gonna but then you're just gonna hear sort of this spammy, not spammies necessarily, but just the complaint train. Like, this does not work for me because you didn't consider rare case number 2732, which for me is the color green. Like, what does that even mean? Like, we don't know. So I think it's tough.
You're right, but I think the gold standards for web components are very good start, and I don't want to. I don't care about how well the code is written. I care about the API of the element, the accessibility of the element. Its customizability. I don't know if it's a word. So I think, of course, it's still a little subjective, but it's something we can do reasonably well, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I like the gold standard. I don't mean to say that the gold standard is not a good way to gauge elements, but while the standard is good for gauging elements, there's a number of other things that, as developers, we probably want. Like, while this element might meet the criterion for the gold standard, well, it doesn't have any demos, it doesn't have any documentation, it doesn't have necessarily a community around it, which is why I think that we've ended up with so many sort of different libraries and frameworks around the web components concept, right? Is because we're still not all sure, right? We're trying to figure out quite what works best. We all pretty much agree that vanilla would be awesome if vanilla wasn't necessarily, well, you need vanilla obviously at the low level to make all the rest of the things, but at the same time, it doesn't give you all the features that we want, which is why we have libraries and frameworks to deal with these things. They add the syntactic sugar that we want as developers to make our lives simpler, as opposed to having to write vanilla all day long and say, oh, well, I got to deal with my own data binding now, or I've got to deal with XYZ 27 things. So I think there is, I think the gold standard is a good way as a first gauge, but I think we still end up with that subjective sort of criterion of, well, this one won't work for me because of X or Y. But I still think, rating them would be a decent start.
Yeah, I talked a lot about designing web components in my publishing web components talk at GDG DevFest DC, and one of the things that struck me is if you make these things small, and this is a struggle, because typically we will make them too big or too small. Like, you don't want to have a button recreated, but you don't want to have some giant calendar as one component by itself with no composed components. So the simpler you get it, the easier it is to follow that gold standard. But you have to really design these things with a lot of this stuff in mind. And I think for me personally, and this is just my opinion, but I kind of agree that a lot of these web components, if they were vanilla, they're small, they're composable, then we could have stuff like Angular 2 or Aurelia or any other frameworks do the data binding for us. They interface through their APIs using custom events, using attributes, properties, and that's how regular HTML works. So I don't really think that data binding is a big issue for web components.
No, it's a good point. I mean, it really does depend on how you compose the thing that you want to build to the other thing, and a calendar would be a good probably example of that, of something that could be composed of tiny bits of things and then bind it out however you want with whatever framework or thing that you've built to do the rest of the sort of things that, because we want them to be DOM objects, we want them to be the same sort of things that an APIs that we've always used, which is why web components are awesome, because they do act like those things and we want them to. And then you go back in time and look at sort of the work that other UI sort of widgets and frameworks sort of did in the past. You look at, I was a heavy user of jQuery UI for a long time. It was a great set of UI tools that really simplified, a significant portion of corporate development life. But they were still, to some extent, somewhat hard to use, right? And they didn't necessarily they were not necessarily composed of tinier pieces. A lot of it was you just sort of had to figure out, even though they had great documentation and everything else. So, yeah, I agree. If you built smaller pieces that were composable together, life would be simpler overall.
And this is one of the things about Bosonic I thought was interesting, was that it is very simple and small, and I like that a lot. So, nice work.
Thank you.
So on that note, if people want to find you or help contribute to the project, what are the best things that they can do? Obviously, pull requests over issues are probably going to be received a lot better. But where do they need to go? What's your Twitter handle? How can they help?
My Twitter handle is Goldoraf. or Bosonic _project for the project one. And of course, the main, the central thing to contribute is GitHub, obviously.
And Justin, any final passing words for everyone?
Have a good weekend. And thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much.
It's always a joy.
Thank you, guys. It was fun.
Sweet.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at Plus the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at @Isaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.